Start recording. There we go. We're recording. Okay. So before I begin, is there any questions about what we talked about last week? Probably many, but nothing that comes to mind. All right. Well, if something pops into your head, let me know. Okay. So let's talk about water. Okay. Water. Who here likes to soak their pots when they wash dishes?
You wash the dishes.
Yeah. Me, when you live in my house, because I don't cook. All right, so my spouse does the dishwashing, and I have to wash the dishes. So, anyways, and I used to wash dishes in a nursing home for many years, and they used to burn the heck out of the pots and pans, and then in the 9 pans I call them. One of the worst things to clean off of a burnt pan is macaroni and cheese. All right. So, point being is, what I used to do is soak it, and the soaking, I didn't realize at the time, the properties of water, it's a solvent, so it'll help to break down, all right, some of the caked on garbage that's on some of these. And what will happen with water is water will spontaneously, I'm going to draw your attention to this formula way down here. Water will spontaneously, we all know the molecular formula for water is H2O, okay, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. It'll spontaneously dissociate. And that means it'll just break apart, okay, to form ions. You guys remember what ions are? What are ions? Charged particles. They're either going to be a positively charged particle or a negatively charged particle. All right, but so it breaks down into these charged particles. Okay, so this formula down here shows you what it breaks down to. Okay, it'll break down into a hydrogen ion. This is also known as a proton. Please don't get it confused for the subatomic particle that lives inside the nucleus of an atom. Okay, for whatever reason, they decided to call a hydrogen ion also a proton. Okay, so I'll try to keep calling it a hydrogen ion so you don't get confused. So you have a hydrogen ion, positively charged hydrogen ion, and then you have a negatively charged OH molecule that's known as hydroxide. Okay, so we have a hydrogen ion and a hydroxide ion, and it breaks down into equal parts. Okay. So you have 1 molecule of a hydrogen ion and then 1 molecule of a hydroxide ion. Okay, so we're going to revisit that in a moment, but just understand that it breaks apart. So water will do this just spontaneously on its own. It just starts to bust apart. And in fact, if you want to know how much, all right, 1 out of 10 million ions per liter will start to just spontaneously dissociate. Okay, just randomly. Okay, so that's when this formula up here shows you what happens when you have more than 1 water molecule. Okay? All right, it's not terribly important for this chapter, but just know, all right, when 1 water molecule breaks down, we wind up with this. Okay? Well, if you have another water molecule there, sometimes that hydrogen ion will jump onto it and it will form this structure right here, which is called hydronium. All right, it's a hydronium ion. That's the only time you're going to hear me talk about it. Okay, but just people have asked, what happens when there's more than 1 water molecule? All right, does anything happen? Interaction? Yes, you'll get this. Okay. Point being is I want you to be more concerned about this formula here. Okay. So keep in mind this is an important concept right here. You will have equal numbers of positive hydrogen ions and negative hydroxyl ions. Equal numbers. Okay? That's why when we'll talk about the pH scale, that's why water is what we call neutral. It has a pH value of 7. And I'll go over the pH scale here with you. Okay? So we'll talk about that. Okay, good so far? If I'm going too slow, tell me to speed up. If I'm going too fast, I'll slow down for you. Okay? All right. So moving here, this is just kind of a reiteration here about water being the universal solvent, but I want to draw your attention to these 2 terms here, all right? Or actually these 2 ideas about substances that do not dissolve in water and substances that do dissolve in water, okay? So a substance that does not dissolve in water is a non-polar molecule, and we call those hydrophobic, okay? Water theorine. You know what else is water theorine? A rabid dog. True story. Honest, true. God, if you see a dog on a hot day and it's not drinking water, obviously, you know, and it looks like it's ready to die, not die, but pass out, all right, stay away from it. Because rabid dogs have a fear of water. Okay? Anyways, nonpolar molecules have a fear of water, meaning, look at olive oil. If you're ever cooking pasta, I don't know any of you that cook pasta, and that's one of the few things that I can cook and not burn, all right, is that I'll pour a little bit of olive oil into the water, and you'll see it kind of, not congealing, but it'll kind of be separated from the water, all right? It's nonpolar, okay? Always ask me to update this. All right. So keep in mind, nonpolar molecules do not dissolve in water. Those are hydrophobic, okay? Substances that do dissolve in water are polar molecules, okay, and ions. Make sure that you know that.
Is that like applicable across the board?
For our purposes. Okay. There's always exceptions to the rules, but for our class, yes, that's going to be applicable across the board, all right? So we refer to these as hydrophilic. They like to dissolve in water. You add it to water and it breaks apart. It disperses or dissolves, okay? I'm going to keep it simple here. All right, so make sure that you understand that because that will have some consequences in biology, all right, when we're talking about biochemistry. We're not going to get into a lot of details in this course in biochemistry. If you want to, you can take a biochemistry course. Has anyone taken a biochemistry course? Mm-mm. How about an organic chemistry course?
Wait, what if you're doing?
Are you doing both right now?
No,
Oh, all right. I was going to say, you hate yourself because those are very hard classes.
I think there's like a class that's better. Biochemistry.
And organic chemistry? I'd be surprised.
Introduction.
Oh, okay, all right. Because organic chemistry is one of the hardest classes I ever took, but it's a good class. All right, let's talk about acids and bases, all right? These concepts that we are going to be learning today, or that I'll be introducing you to today, are going to follow you through, all right, Bio 210 and 211. It'll help you understand certain physiological properties that occur, especially when you get to digestive tract, the digestive chapter, which is in Bio 211. All right, so know this definition, okay? So an acid dissociates in water, and when it does, it will produce a hydrogen ion and an anion. What's an anion? An anion is a negatively charged electron, so it actually is going to gain electrons. Okay, remember cation, soft, cuddly, positive to be around. We like cations. Not to say that we don't like anions. All right, but hey Tammy, but anions are going to be negatively charged ions. Okay, so when we add acid to water and it disassociates, it'll break apart, it'll create a hydrogen ion, okay, and then an anion, okay? So an example will be hydrochloric acid, and I'll go over that with you in a moment, all right? And well, there's carbonic acid. So we will call an acid a proton donor, okay? Because remember, going back to what I told you before, a hydrogen ion, this guy right here, is also known as a proton, okay? So acids will donate protons. They'll make protons available. They'll make hydrogen ions available. So when we add an acid to water and it breaks apart, okay, because remember, if we go down here, here's substance A, it's an acid that we add to water. Look, when it breaks apart, we get these, okay? So does it make sense that if we add a lot of substance A to water, that we'll get a lot of hydrogen ions? Therefore, increasing the concentration of free hydrogen ions in our water solution? Well, that's what happens, okay? So, the easier that it is, or the more dissociation, that's when that acid breaks apart, all right? The more dissociation that occurs, the stronger the acid. You want to understand that relationship, okay? So the more dissociation that we see, all right, when we add an acid to water, okay, the stronger the acid. Hydrochloric acid, for example, in the stomach is an example of a strong acid, okay, because it can dissociate relatively easily when we add it to water, okay. It's got a pH value of 1. In our stomach, it has a pH value of about 2.3, 2.5. And that's still pretty good because that can burn a hole in that desktop that you're writing your notes on, okay? So, because its pH value goes to normally it's a pH value of 1, which is very strong, and I'll go over the pH scale with you. The lower the number, the stronger the acid. Okay? The higher the number or the weaker the acid or the stronger the base. And I'll explain that all to you. Okay? So if we see less dissociation when we add an acid to water, and it doesn't break apart as easily, then it's a weaker acid. Okay? And you'll learn about carbonic acid in the blood. It's one of the ways that we can buffer, all right, our blood. Okay? Yeah, you made it. Welcome. Welcome to the party. Who says that? Bruce Willis? Die Hard? No one here has seen Die Hard?
Oh, yeah.
Right. I won't say the famous quote because then you'd report me. All right. It's one of the best Christmas movies ever. I make my kids watch it every year. They're 4 and 6. Just kidding. All right. But Elf is a great Christmas movie. Okay. So those are acids. Okay. Keep that in mind. So when we look at hydrochloric acid, HCl, okay, when we add it to water, it does this. H plus and Cl negative. And that's what happens. So here is our hydrogen. Here's our hydrogen ion right here. And here is our anion. Okay, it finally worked. I wasn't worried for a moment, Alexia. I knew you were going to get here. And if not, you could always watch the sessions later on. Welcome. Okay, are we good with that so far? Okay, all right. So we learned about acids. Now we need to learn about bases. Okay, so when we add an acid to water, it dissociates. Okay, and we wind up with a lot of hydrogen ions, possibly, and an anion. Well, guess what? A base accepts hydrogen ions. So it's like a sponge. Okay? So when you add it to a solution, and if there's any free-floating hydrogen ions floating around, all right, there was a video game back in the 80s called Pac-Man, and that's what a base does. It goes around, and it looks around for hydrogen ions, and it gobbles them up, right, like a sponge. And that's what it does. Okay, so therefore we call it a proton acceptor. So if it's going to go around and gobble up the hydrogen ions that are in the solution, then wouldn't it make sense that it decreases the concentration of hydrogen ions in that solution, right? All right, you don't have to memorize that. You can figure that out on your own, okay? So, therefore, the more absorption of these hydrogen ions that occur, all right, the stronger the base. All right, so a lot of the cleaners that you use in your house are great bases. Ammonia, bleach. Bleach is probably the #1 best way to sterilize any surface or anything. In fact, some of your white blood cells are nice enough to make bleach. So when they suck in or take in a bacteria, they'll combine it with an organelle, which we'll learn about, all right, in chapter 4. They'll combine it with an organelle, and that organelle makes bleach, and it makes hydrogen peroxide. And here you thought that hydrogen peroxide was good just for dyeing your eyebrows. No, it helps to kill bacteria, and it helps to sterilize things, okay? So ammonia and bleach, they're great cleaners. They're wonderful, okay? But they're also strong bases, okay? So less absorption that occurs of hydrogen ions, the weaker the base.
Is that a way to measure the pH or something?
By
Seeing the availability of protons?
Yep, it's great. Yep, and I'll show you a picture. Yep, that's a great way to tell. So you'll see here's another buffer in your body, bicarbonate. All right, and so again, it is used to buffer your blood, but it's also used in your small intestine, all right, to help buffer the acidity of your stomach. Because remember, I told you the pH of your stomach, all right, is about 2.3, 2.5, all right? And when it pours out from your stomach into your small intestine, you'll burn a hole right through your small intestine. So guess what? Your small intestine, all right, and some of your other, what we call accessory digestive organs have figured out a way to try to neutralize or buffer the pH. We'll talk about what neutralization is and buffering is, okay? All right, So here's what we do. We take substance B, we add it to water, okay? And what will happen is, if we have any free-floating hydrogen ions, all right, our base will then attach itself to those hydrogen ions, all right, thereby decreasing, all right, the concentration of the free hydrogen ions floating around in water. That's what bases do. You go around, they sponge things up, okay? Like that younger brother that lives in your basement for 10 years, okay? Sponging off of mom and dad. No, I lived in my parents' basement for 15. I just got out. That's why I'm here. No, I'm just kidding. All right, here we go. So normally the answers wouldn't pop up, but anyways, what type of substance will release hydrogen ions when it's added to water? Acids, okay? Are acids. All right, so these next 3 slides, big concepts. I'm going to take my time, kind of move through it, all right, at a nice even keel pace here. All right, let me just switch over here. Good, everybody's good. Okay, so the pH, all right, you've heard me talk about the pH scale. So what the heck is the pH scale? It basically tells us how much hydrogen ions are present. So I don't know your name, but to answer your question, yes. Okay? So it's going to tell you roughly about how much is in the solution, and what we base the scale off of are the measuring, the measuring units that we use for the scale is 0 to 14. Okay? With the number at the center being 7, that is neutral. So 7 is neutral. And do you guys remember why 7 is neutral?
Because that's how many ions are in hydrogen.
Because, well, similarly, you're close. It's because when it disassociates, it creates equal hydrogen ions and equal hydroxide ions. It creates, or you could say it creates equal positive ions and equal negative ions, cations, anions, okay? So keep that in mind. That's why plain water is neutral, all right? So you need to know the values of the pH scale. 0 to 14, 7 is neutral, okay? So we already saw this statistic, 1 out of 10 million, all right? Water molecules, when it disassociates, you'll wind up with equal parts of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, okay? So if you want to get into the math of it, I will not ask you this, okay? But if you wanted to get into the math of it, it's going to look something like this for water. Anyone here take trigonometry ever? Logarithms? Not to age myself, but did anyone ever get a chance to use a graphing calculator in high school? Yeah. Well, when I was in high school, we didn't have a graphing calculator. So, yeah, so we didn't get the opportunity to do that. We had to do it using charts. All right, so I'm not going to be worried about the math. This isn't a math class. It's a bio class. So you need to know this concept here, right here. Big concept, all right? pH, okay, and hydrogen ion concentration are inversely related. Does anyone know what inversely related means? Exactly. When one goes up, the other one goes down. Okay? So we can describe it as the inverse log, or we can describe it like this. As your hydrogen ion concentration increases, the pH value decreases. Okay? So the more, basically, you can also say the more acidic something is, all right, that means the more hydrogen ions that are present, the lower its pH. Okay, and then vice versa. As our hydrogen ion concentration decreases, our pH value will increase. Okay, so what do bases do? They decrease the hydrogen ion concentration. So therefore, their pH value is going to be high. All right, I'll show you this on a slide here. It's also in your book. Okay, questions about that? Okay, not so bad. Okay. So, how do we interpret this scale here? Okay. if something is neutral, like water, all right, it'll have a pH value of 7, which means we have equal concentrations of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. All right, I think you guys are probably sick and tired of me saying that, so we're good. So as we increase, all right, our hydrogen ion concentration, and it becomes more than the hydroxide ion concentration, all right, then that substance is acidic. So it'll have a pH value of less than 7, 6.8, 6.4, okay, 3. Those are all acidic substances, right? Obviously, the substance that has a pH value of 3 is more acidic than something that has a pH value of 6.4, okay? And so conversely, solutions that have more hydroxide ions, or that have fewer hydrogen ions, all right, we refer to them as being basic or alkaline. And so they'll have a pH value greater than 7. All right. So when we go from a pH value, all right, of, well, I'll use the example down here, of 7, which is plain water, to 6, okay, we've increased our hydrogen ion concentration by the power of 10 times greater, okay? And then you go from 6 to 5, then it's another 10 times, okay? So each value, all right, as we get lower, all right, from 5 to 4 is going to be another 10 times. So what we refer to as a tenfold change. All right, now we can tie this all together in this next picture here. Here we go. This is in your book, it's figure 2.15. All right, and it shows you here, you've got your pure water value, all right, of 7, okay? And then obviously, here's our pH scale right here. 0 at the top, 14 at the bottom. All right, and you can see as we go from 7 down to these lower numbers here, if we go over to our beaker over here on our left side, you can see there's lots of hydrogen ions floating around, okay? As we go down the scale and get to our higher numbers, 12, 13, 14, you can see that we have less hydrogen ions here, okay? So what we're doing in these pictures is showing you the progression, okay, of the hydrogen ion concentration and the pH value, that inverse relationship there, okay? And that's basically what this is telling us here, all right? The greater the hydrogen ion concentration, all right, compared to the hydroxide ion concentration, we're going to decrease our pH value. And vice versa for our bases. So you can see here some examples. All right, here's hydrochloric acid. Hey, your stomach makes that, all right? But the pH in your stomach isn't 1 because there's other things in your stomach. So it mixes around with some other components, so it floats around 2 to 3, okay? So that varies, which is good because if it gets pretty low, stomach ulcers, that's a problem. It can burn through the stomach lining there. There's other causes for that. It's not just the hydrochloric acid getting out of control. There's certain bacteria that help it along also, all right? But you can see tomato juice, lemon juice, that's pretty acidic, okay? And then when we go down here, all right, some of these other substances on the alkaline side or the base side here, all right, ammonia, bleach, they have pretty high pH values here. All right, sodium hydroxide, pretty high, 14, okay? That's a huge sponge. It likes to run around and suck hydrogen ions up out of any solution, okay? All right, this next slide, big concepts. You need to know this, okay? So the first one, and they're similar, but they're not the same, okay? Neutralization. Easy way to remember that is we want to get our pH value back to neutral. So if it's a pH value of 3, all right, we want to get back to 7. If it's a pH value of 10, we want to get back to 7. Okay? So what we're saying here is, when you have a solution that becomes too acidic or too basic, we need to get it back to the neutral value of 7. Okay? So how would I do that? If something's acidic, I would add a base to it. Okay? Antacids, perfect example. Your stomach starts to produce too much hydrochloric acid, and there's really nothing in there for it to digest. All right? It will irritate the stomach lining. So what do? You take a Tums. Okay? And the Tums are loaded, all right, those antacids are loaded with base. And so they help to return your pH value of your stomach back to 7. Okay? So if something's too basic or alkaline, all right, to neutralize it, you add an acid. Okay? All right. Buffers. Buffers are like the preventative medicine of when your pH value in your body gets out of hand. They try to prevent the pH value of changing, all right, for your blood, for example, or for your stomach acid, okay? So they help to prevent pH changes, okay? So remember we were talking about in chapter 1, all right, about homeostasis. You guys remember the set point, all right? That's that point that, depending on what system we're talking about, that your body wants to keep the values of the physiological functioning around. So like your body temperature, 98.6, it likes to keep it close to that number. Well, for your blood, the pH of your blood, all right, it likes to keep it in this range of 7.35 to 7.45. So normally the pH value of your blood is 7.4. Slightly basic, okay? But this is the number that your body keeps it around, okay? And so if it becomes too acidic, it's going to try to utilize, all right, a base to try to change it back to the neutral, not the neutral, but to its physiological value there, okay? So when we talk about buffers, all right, they can do two things. They can accept hydrogen ions, all right, when you have too much acid, or they can donate hydrogen ions, all right, to neutralize a base, okay? So it's like a neutralization happens after the fact. The pH has already changed. All right, now we got to get it back to neutral. Well, buffers are going to try to prevent that change because it could be a gradual, slight change. Say your pH is at 7.4, and then in 5 minutes it drops to 7.2, and then it drops a little bit more. In like 10 minutes, it drops down to 7. All right, your body senses that. All right, you'll learn more about that in 211, but then it goes into certain effects. Like if it's in your blood, all right, your kidneys will start to resorb certain materials, or if you're starting to become too acidic, it'll start to excrete acid into your urine. All right, the hydrogen ions. It'll excrete the hydrogen ions and kick them out. You'll learn all about this when you do renal physiology next semester. I love teaching 211. Not to say that I don't love teaching 210. I get a thrill out of teaching you guys the basics, but then I also get a thrill seeing people learn, the big stuff. All right, so what is the general relationship, right, of hydrogen ions and pH? This is that inverse, all right, relationship that we talked about. All right, so when we increase our hydrogen ion concentration, our pH value will decrease. All right, and when we move from one number to another, like from 6 to a 5, that's going to be a 10-fold difference in that concentration of the hydrogen ions. Okay, if you know that, you're good. You'll be good to go. And that's just the beginning. You get to learn more about this stuff later on, but that's all I'm going to teach you. Because now we're going to start to kind of switch gears. We're going to kind of leave chemistry behind us now. Now we're going to move off, all right, into more of into biology, okay? So we're going to kind of swing over towards, has anyone ever heard of the macro diet or a macro diet? I should say the macro diet. If you ever have like one of your friends says, oh, I'm counting my macros. They're talking about macromolecules, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, right? So that's what they're referring to. Well, that's what we're going to learn about now. We're going to learn about our macromolecules. And I'm going to tell you this right now. You guys are going to get tired of me saying this, but that's okay, because I'm not doing my job if you're not getting tired of me saying this. macromolecules, especially when we get to proteins, all right, but lipids too, carbohydrates, all of them. You need to learn this stuff because when you get to the later on chapters, it's going to be assumed that you already understand all this. So take the time now to learn it and own it, because when you have to learn the more complicated concepts, it'll be no thing. All right, you'll be able to get it with no problem. Okay, so what is a macromolecule? It is not only large, but it's an organic molecule. All right, that is made by the body. Okay, so you have to know this. It's always going to contain these three elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Anything by chemist standards that has a carbon molecule inside of it and its molecular formula is considered to be an organic molecule. Okay, got into an argument with a high school teacher over this, and of course we went on Google and looked it up, and I was right.
Isn't that literally the definition?
By chemical standard, for a chemist, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So if it has carbon, it is organic. Okay. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Some of them, not all of them, all right, might have nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So we're going to talk about the carbon skeleton. All right. When these molecules have carbon in them, okay, and we attach, all right, a hydrogen to them, those are referred to as hydrocarbons. And we're going to revisit this in a moment, but I just wanted to show this, this definition to you. All right. So these hydrocarbons only have carbon and hydrogen atoms. Only. Nothing else. No sulfur, no phosphorus, no oxygen. Okay. So we refer to those as hydrocarbons. Easy enough, right? Okay. This next section here, functional groups. All right. Functional groups, all right, to kind of give you a broad definition, will give certain characteristics to a molecule. All right. So what you need to know is, all right, functional groups are mostly polar. Okay. And they will create a hydrogen bond. So remember, we talked about polarity, all right, a little bit when we talked about electronegativity. You know how sometimes in a single molecule like water, when I drew this picture here, you got your water here, and then you got your hydrogen ions over here, okay? And those hydrogen ions are going to have a partial charge that's going to be negative, and the oxygen is going to have a partial charge of positive, because the hydrogen ions can pull the electrons closer to their nucleus, and so it shifts, all right, the electrons closer to that side, and it makes that part of the molecule more negative. So it gives it that polarity, all right? When we're talking about covalent bonding, all right? But when we talk about the polarity of these functional groups, is that these whole groups, if we talk about amino acids, for example, all right, you're going to have certain functional groups on an amino acid, and these functional groups will impart a charge to one end of the amino acid and another charge to the other end. And so you'll have one part of the molecule being positive, the other part being negative, all right? Point being is, that's what we're talking about with these functional groups, all right? They'll be polar. They'll impart some polarity, some negative and positive charges to a molecule here, all right? So some will act like acids, which we just talked about, the carboxyl group. You'll see those in amino acids. That's why I mentioned the amino acids. And then some will act like bases, all right? And they'll have an amine group in there, all right? That's going to be some nitrogen we threw in there and some hydrogen, okay? That's all you need to know, all right? So later on, when you're reading and studying some of this stuff and you hear functional groups, the only thing I want you to know is they're going to impart certain characteristics upon a certain molecule, all right? All right, here we go. Let's have some fun. Let's talk about fats, okay? All right, lipids. Lipids. This is our first macromolecule that we are going to discuss, okay? So some of the characteristics that you need to know. One, they're water insoluble. Well, we already talked about when something is water insoluble, it does not dissolve in the water, right? And those are non-polar, all right, substances. That's the example I told you about boiling the water for spaghetti and pouring olive oil in it. Okay? Well, the olive oil, all right, the water insoluble characteristic, all right, is what causes olive oil not to dissolve into the water when you're making pasta. So, some of the functions of lipids. This is huge. You need to know this because we're going to be talking about this throughout this semester and even into 211. One, it's stored energy. Well, that's good. Because back in the day when we were hunter-gatherers, we didn't know necessarily when our next meal was coming. So, and we were primarily a nomadic species, so we moved around a lot. So we needed to have food on hand. Well, we couldn't. This is before the day of, all right, MREs or refrigeration and whatnot. So you ate what you could, and then you would hunt or gather. All right. So you would store that energy as fat. Okay. Also, lipids are going to be found, and we'll talk more about this in chapter 4, all right, in parts of our cellular membrane. Okay, what we call the plasma membrane. It's this envelope that sits outside the cell, and it limits what can enter into a cell and what can leave the cell. All right, it's got a lot of really cool characteristics. And then hormones. All right, what are hormones? Take a guess.
Natural things that are used to make something.
That's good. I
And
mean,
regulate blood.
that's a very good, vague definition. It's a thing that does stuff. No, what a hormone is, it's a chemical messenger. I'll keep it just as vague. It's a chemical messenger. Remember, the nervous system uses electricity to send signals and have effects on the body. Well, the endocrine system uses glands, and that's the chemical message. It uses chemicals for things to occur. Okay. So remember, I told you there's two systems that are part of our control center: the central nervous, well, the nervous system, and then the endocrine system. Those are our control centers. All right. So there's 4 classes, and we're going to talk about each of these briefly. Okay. Triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and eicosanoids. Okay. So let's start off here with our triglycerides. All right. These guys, their main purpose here, and for those of you that have ever had to, I won't say give blood, but if your doctor says, all right, I want to do a blood panel on you and check your cholesterol and all that, they check your triglycerides. Okay? And so your triglycerides are energy storage. And the slide refers to it as long-term. Well, yeah. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to package up these triglycerides, and we're going to store them in a special tissue called adipose tissue. Okay? For later on. But your body loves triglycerides. It loves fats. Fats are the best energy source in your body. You get the most bang for your buck. So that's why I always tell people, you should have fat in your diet. You should. All right? There's plant fat and there's animal fat. Okay? But you should have fat in your diet. It's necessary, and especially for babies. If you're under the age of 1, you need fat in your diet. All right? Because that fat helps to your nervous system to develop. If you're depriving a baby of fat, something wrong with you. All right. Anyways, glycerol and 3 fatty acids make up a triglyceride. I'm going to come back to this slide here real fast. Here's a picture of a triglyceride right here. All right. So this is what the molecule looks like. So these 3 red balls, that's the glycerol molecule. And then these strings of black balls and blue balls, those are fatty acids. Okay? So when we look here, you can see this pink structure here is representing the glycerol molecule. All right? And then you can see these fatty acids, these chains here, they're different. Okay? But I want you to see, all right, remember what I told you these dashed lines between elements are? These guys right here, those represent chemical bonds, covalent bonds, right? Cells look at those and see dollar signs, energy, okay? When you snap those cells, you make energy, and that's what your cell wants to do, all right? So when we snap this, each one of these is a specific amount of energy that your body will use for certain biological processes, all right? So some fatty acids all right, can be really long. All right, these are short chain fatty acids. You can have medium chain and then obviously long chain. And so long chain are really, really long. So you get a lot of energy out of those. All right. So back to this slide here. Okay. So when we talk about our triglycerides, you'll have the 3 fatty acid chains that are attaching onto that glycerol molecule. Okay. And so the fatty acid chains will vary in length. And they'll also vary in the number of double bonds. All right. A single bond has a decent amount of energy, but a double bond has more energy. And guess what? A triple bond has a lot more energy. Okay. So that's what your body likes to do. It likes to break these triple bonds, these double bonds, and if it has to, the single bonds, because it means energy that it can use for certain cell processes. So when we talk about saturated, all right, triglycerides or saturated fats, they have no double bonds. Okay. Unsaturated have 1 double bond. And then finally, polyunsaturated, that poly means many, will have 2 or more double bonds. Okay. All right, those are your triglycerides here. You look at it for some of the purposes that we'll use triglycerides, primarily energy storage here, but also what we're going to use them for are going to be structural support in our bodies, cushioning, and insulation. Okay, triglycerides like to make lipids, form fat. So, all right, if you have, do you think a person, has anyone here ever done a polar plunge? Jump into freezing cold water? And I'm not talking about Lake Hartwell in October, all right? I'm talking about where you have to bust the ice open and jump into the lake, all right? Let me tell you something. I did it with a buddy of mine, and this is when I was much younger and I had a lot less body fat on myself. And he was a portly fellow. He liked to describe himself as pleasantly plump, but a bigger fellow. He had a lot more adipose tissue on him. Well, he stayed in that water almost for 2 minutes. I stayed in it for about 2 seconds. And again, what my point being is, right, these lipids will help to create our insulation. And we'll talk about the different types of, and when we talk about tissues, but the adipose tissue helps to keep your body warm. All right? There's a layer underneath your skin. It's called the subcutaneous layer. And it's primarily made up of adipose tissue, which is primarily made up of fat. Okay? Also, cushioning and structural support. You're going to find, all right, these lipids in the adipose tissue around certain organs. Your kidneys are surrounded by what we call perirenal fat. It helps with the kidneys so they're not sloshing around in your body. They're held relatively secure in place, all right? But if you get jostled, all right, quite a bit, okay, this perirenal fat protects the kidneys from getting damaged, all right? There's some around the liver. Has anyone here ever heard of the term fatty liver? Certain drugs can cause the deposition or the depositing of fat around certain organs. You'll get it around your intestines, around your stomach, all right? But again, it acts as cushioning, but it also helps as structural support, keeps things in place, okay? So when we talk about adipose tissue, okay, so when you eat a meal and you've used up everything, or your body's taking whatever it needs from that meal, and it says, wow, I've got a bunch of leftovers. What do you do with your leftovers after a meal? Do you really? I hate leftovers, so I shouldn't say I hate it. I take that back. I'm not a big fan of leftover. I'll never eat leftover fish. I don't care how good it is, unless it's sushi, maybe. But anyways, I take my leftovers and I put it in the refrigerator. Your body is going to take its leftovers when it's triglycerides, and it's going to store it as adipose tissue, okay? So when it takes the excess triglycerides, all right, it's going to put it into adipose tissue. When it does that, that process is called lipogenesis. All right, lipo being lipids or fat, all right, and then genesis is to create, to make, to build. So it's telling you what it's doing. We're making fat. Now, you're a marathon runner, okay, and you start to run your marathon, and in the first 5 minutes, you've used up all the glycogen in your muscles. Well, you still got about 2 more hours to run, all right? So you need to get energy somewhere. So you use up the rest of your glycogen from your liver. That takes maybe about 10, 20 more minutes. So you're out of glycogen, which is the stored form of sugar. Okay? So your body needs another energy source. Guess where it goes? It goes to your adipose tissue because it needs your adipose tissue, all right, to help to make energy so you can run. So it will start to break down the adipose tissue, all right, the fat, all right, or those triglycerides. And when it does that, we refer to that process as lipolysis. Okay? Lysis is to break down. So if we dissect this word, lysis is to break down. What are we breaking down? Fats. Stored fats. Yes, sir.
So like when you're working out, you have to be like pushing yourself to 70 or 80% of your heart rate in order to burn fat.
That's a great question. I don't think I'm going to be talking about that when we discuss the muscles chapter. But here's the thing. For folks that are into exercise physiology, ideally when you are working out aerobically, which means you have plenty of oxygen to do these workouts, easy way to tell is if you're able to talk. So if I'm on a run and I'm running and we're running together and I'm talking to you the whole time, aside from the fact that it might be incredibly annoying, I am using oxygen and I'm exercising aerobically. So I'm able to burn roughly about 50% fat and 50% carbohydrates. All right. My heart rate will be a little bit lower then. When you're talking about that 80% range, then I'm going to be pushing what we call anaerobic respiration, and I have insufficient oxygen. And we'll talk about this is a great segue, but we'll do that in chapter 4 later on. But oxygen helps us to get energy much more efficiently. If I'm exercising anaerobically, what I'm going to be doing is burning mainly 80% carbohydrates and only 20% fat. So it shifts. And that's why they want you to keep your heart rate within a certain range. When you go up above 80%, then you're really starting to push anaerobic respiration. Yes, ma'am. Correct. Yep. And we'll talk about that when we do the skin. But there's two types of tissues that are going to be in the subcutaneous layer. It's going to be areolar connective tissue and adipose connective tissue. But yeah, we'll talk about that. All right. So here's the picture of triglycerides. We already saw that. All right. So the next type of lipid is the phospholipids. Okay. And this family of lipids are going to play a huge role in the makeup of our cell membranes. All right. So if you look here, they have both polar and non-polar components. And we'll see a closer look at these when we get into chapter 4. All right. We refer to that as the amphipathic molecule. And what that is basically a molecule that has polar and non-polar components to it. And essentially it looks like, and I'm drawing it on its side, all right, this guy right here. So we'll get into the definition or the makeup of it a little bit more. So it's similar to triglyceride. Instead of having 3 fatty acids, it's only got 2, okay? And so we refer to these 2 fatty acids as its tail, okay? So that's a hydrophobic tail because those fatty acids are nonpolar. Remember, fatty acids are nonpolar. They won't dissolve in water, okay? The other end, this little circle end here, that's going to be our glycerol molecule, phosphate, and some of our organic groups. This part is polar. Remember what we said, polar molecules and ions will dissolve in water, all right? So they are hydrophilic. Okay. We're looking good on time. I'm telling you guys, I get practice on Monday night and Wednesday night. You guys are set Tuesday and Thursday. Questions so far? I know a lot of what I'm throwing at you is just kind of pure memorization, and so it's not really easy all to absorb in, okay? But once you learn some of the smaller details, it'll kind of explain things a little bit better for you when you start to learn some of the bigger concepts there. All right, we're going to revisit phospholipids. Don't sweat it. We're going to revisit phospholipids in chapter 4 when we're going over the parts of the plasma membrane. All right, steroids. We're all familiar with steroids. We've heard about steroids, all right? Good and bad. You have anabolic steroids and catabolic steroids. Anabolic are the ones that the bodybuilders use. Catabolic are going to be what you get injected when you sprain your knee, okay? So steroids are hydrocarbons. Remember what I said, a hydrocarbon is a structure that has only carbons with hydrogens attached to them. But they make ring structures here, and I'll show you. And there's a variety of different configurations for the rings. You can have a 4-carbon ring, you can have a 6-carbon ring, you can have a 5-carbon ring. Just understand that the rings, they vary from the number of carbons, okay? So one of the important things that you want to understand when we're talking about steroids are these 3 guys here: cholesterol, steroid hormones, obviously, and then bile salts, right? Cholesterol is very, very important. It's utilized for many things. Every single, molecule, every single cell in your body has cholesterol in its plasma membrane. Cholesterol allows, have you ever seen, and I forgot there was a name of it, it was in the Pacific Ocean. It's like this big pile of trash that was floating around. There was like a huge island of garbage, but it was floating on the surface of the ocean, right? That's what your plasma membrane's like, all right? It looks like a fluid pile of garbage floating on the ocean. Well, what cholesterol does is that it allows that your plasma membrane to be very fluid and less stiff, less rigid. Because the more rigid a plasma membrane can be, the more apt it can tear or be damaged. You want your plasma membranes to be very, very flexible, okay? Because they have to undergo a lot of stress, amongst other things, okay? So we see cholesterol in a lot of our plasma membranes here, but also this is hugely important, all right? It's a precursor for steroid synthesis. What that means is when you're making steroids, you're going to start off with cholesterol. That's an ingredient that you have to have, okay? So when you get into chapter 17 and 211, when you're talking about these steroid hormones that your body's making, you need cholesterol, okay? So again, I'm not saying that you have a cholesterol diet only, but you need cholesterol in your diet, okay? Or you need to give your body the ingredients that it needs to make cholesterol. Because you guys have heard of bad cholesterol and good cholesterol, HDLs and LDLs. You'll learn about how that all comes into play, but you definitely need cholesterol in your diet. Quick story. Has anyone here ever heard of Dr. Jordan Peterson? He's a clinical psychiatrist that works at the University of Toronto. And anyways, I watched an interview with him. Dr. Oz interviewed him, and he fascinates me just with some of his thinking. But the last topic that they talked about was his diet. For whatever reason, he says, I hear you love listening to him. Yeah, I know, me too. Read his book if you haven't. I haven't. But it's what, 12 rules? I think it's 12 rules to live by, order to chaos, or guide to chaos. But anyways, he he went on this diet, and it's very, very unconventional. And he said, do not do this diet, all right? But when he went on this diet, in 7 months, he lost 50 pounds. He stopped snoring at night. He was on antidepressants. He stopped taking the antidepressants, and he had, I guess, I won't call it bad psoriasis, but some psoriasis, and it cleared up. And what the diet is water and meat, specifically beef. That's all he eats, all right? And I'm trying to remember so anyways, he said the reason why he went on is because he has food allergies. His wife had food allergies. And you take all of his wife's food allergies and his food allergies and combine it together. I know, exactly. And they gave all their food allergies to their daughter. So it was kind of like one of those things where she was very limited. So while she was, they were trying to figure out what her diet was going to be, he decided, you know what? A lot of people, when they do diets and they find out that you're allergic to something, you're not quite sure, they call it the diet of elimination. You start to take certain things out of your diet and see, all right, does anything change? He said, you know what? I'm going to go the opposite. We're going to do one thing and then see if anything changes. And when he did that one thing, everything changed, obviously. Now, he's not a fat guy. He's pretty lean. Cure everything, but it helped. The point, that was a pretty extreme case there. All right, Steroid hormones, where we're going to see, and then bile salts. This is something that you will be using in your digestive system to help break down fats. Okay. All right. The last subclassification of lipids is eicosanoids. Okay. So eicosanoids all come from this guy right here, arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is found in your plasma membrane. All right? It's a fatty acid found in your plasma membrane. So when you damage your plasma membrane, okay, you sprain your ankle, you smash your hand against the wall, right? And you start to get inflammation, okay, and swelling, all right? What happens is this fatty acid starts to undergo what we call a chemical cascade. It starts to undergo, all right, certain chemical steps or processes, all right, and it creates these local signaling molecules, okay, in response to that inflammation. It's partially, it's responsible for that inflammation. And it creates, all right, these four classes of eicosanoids: prostaglandins, prostacyclines, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. All right. If you get into pharmacology, you will go into this in much more depth. Right? But those four classes are essentially just chemical messengers that your body uses, mainly involved in the inflammatory response. And I won't ask because of HIPAA, all right? But asthmatics have problems with these two, thromboxanes and leukotrienes, and there's certain medications out there because asthma is an allergic reaction which causes inflammation in the smooth muscle of the bronchioles. I have asthma, all right? And I worked with a research group up in New York, and we were messing around with leukotrienes and thromboxane inhibitors, because if we can block these chemical messengers, all right, then we can decrease inflammation and therefore decrease asthma attacks. Okay? Yes, sir.
So would methylcholine be the opposite?
Say that one more time.
Methylcholine. Is that what would make it react, right?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, now you're jumping into the farm, but yeah, methylcholine, yeah. Has anyone here ever heard of, oh, I can see it in my head, it just left. But have you ever heard of certain anti-inflammatories like COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitors? All right, COX-1 and 2 are just enzymes in this chemical pathway. So when we start to break down arachidonic acid, it's going to go through this big, long chemical pathway breakdown, all right? And there's going to be certain enzymes along the way. Well, guess what? If you can block the functioning of certain enzymes, you can prevent inflammation, okay? So you have certain drugs that will prevent the formation or prevent the enzymes from working, and then it can block the creation of these eicosanoids here. All right, I went off on a tangent. I apologize. So there is a method to the madness of you learning this stuff. All right. All right. So back to the fatty acids here. I'm sure you've heard of saturated and unsaturated because we talked about them earlier. Okay, saturated, there's no double bonds. Unsaturated, one single double bond, and then the polyunsaturated. Most animal fats are going to be saturated, okay? And then most vegetable fats are going to be unsaturated. So what does that mean? Well, at room temperature, okay, animal fats will become solid, all right? So what do you think that's going to do in your blood if these animal fats are floating around in your blood? It makes it almost like gooey, but you can get plaque buildup. And we don't want that. That's why we try to avoid animal fats. I'm not saying they're all bad, but too much floating around is not good. Vegetable fats will stay liquid at room temperature. So they're less likely to congeal or harden, all right? So that's why we consider them more healthier, okay? So vegetable fats can be converted, all right? These unsaturated fats can be converted into saturated fats, and we call that process hydrogenation. I'm sure you guys have heard that before, hydrogenation. I can't remember, there was a cooking oil, what was it called? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so here's a problem. When we don't completely go through the whole process of hydrogenation, when it's only partially committed, then we get these guys. Blech. Trans fats. You don't want to mess around with those, right? I don't know if in most states they're outlawed, I think. You can't even serve them in restaurants, okay? But these type can significantly increase your chance of heart attack and stroke because when you're dealing with these trans fats, they have a higher likelihood of becoming solid at room temperature. When that's running through and coursing through your body, it increases the likelihood of plaque buildup. All right, so you can get congested coronary arteries. All right, and strokes are usually caused by a blocked artery in the brain. Alrighty. All right. So a couple other lipids here, glycolipids. If we dissect that word, all right, we got a lipid with with the term glyco in front of it. That means sugar, carbohydrate. Okay, so this is a lipid molecule that has a carbohydrate attached to it. All right, and they're used for cellular binding. What I mean by that is you get these glycolipids that will sit there on your plasma membrane, and they will help for chemical messengers that are floating around your body, maybe in your blood or in your interstitial fluid. And a perfect example would be a hormone, okay? Chemical messenger hormone floats by the cell, all right, and it needs to signal that cell to do whatever it's supposed to make. Maybe that cell is supposed to make something, all right? Well, these glycolipids, all right, will be used for that cell binding of that chemical messenger. Fat-soluble vitamins. There's 3 listed here. A, E, and K. Are we missing any? Isn't there one missing there? No? D? Yep, that's right. Yeah, Valerie's right. And what's your name? Yeah.
Oh, Thomas.
Thomas. And Thomas is right. D is a fat-soluble vitamin. Okay, now fat-soluble vitamin means that these vitamins will accumulate in your fat tissue. Okay, so you can actually build up toxic levels. Okay, so you don't want to have too much. Water-soluble, you'll just pee out. Okay, because they're soluble in water. They'll break down and dissolve, supposedly. But anyways, D is not necessarily, I won't get into the argument, but D is considered a fat-soluble vitamin, but also a pro-hormone. So the discussion is still out there as to what to classify it as. But for right now, you wouldn't be wrong if you said it's a fat-soluble vitamin. Okay. So which class of lipids form the cell membranes? Remember, out of the 4 classes, what's the major component for cell membranes? Lisa? I couldn't hear you. Anybody? Oh, no. Phospholipids. Remember the phospholipids? They make up the cell membrane. Yep, phospholipids. Yep. All right, guys, let's talk about sugars. We'll talk about carbohydrates briefly here, when I say briefly, and then we'll jump, and then we should be done for today. I'll stop with proteins. All right, carbohydrates, real quick, okay? Carbohydrates have this chemical formula, which means carbohydrates are only made up of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygen. The N represents how many carbon atoms are present there. Okay, so every single carbon atom will either have, well, not either, but they'll have a hydrogen ion attached to it, all right, and then our hydroxide attached to it. So we classify carbohydrates into monosaccharides, which are called simple sugars, okay, our disaccharides, and our polysaccharides. So it's easy. Mono meaning 1, di meaning 2. So we take 2 monosaccharides, stick them together, we get a disaccharide. All right. If we get many monosaccharides and we string them along, make a long chain, then we get what's known as a polysaccharide. Okay. So monosaccharides are simple sugars, and we saw those in chapter 1, or excuse me, earlier on in this chapter when we were talking about isomers. Remember how we said that you can have a molecular formula versus a structural formula? We talked about glucose, galactose, and fructose. All right, how they all have the same exact molecular formula, but they have different structural formulas. All right, so we saw the simple sugars before. Get familiar with glucose. Your body loves glucose. So much so, it's on the next line. All right, first thing you need to know about glucose, it has 6 carbons. It's the most common simple sugar. And guess what? It is the primary nutrient for energy in your cells. Your cells want glucose, so much so that they'll take proteins and fats and they'll convert them into glucose. They love glucose. You know who the biggest baby is in your body? Take an organ. What do you think is the most needy organ in your body? Brain. Yep, brain. Yep, brain. Yeah, your brain is, it's like that diva, all right? It's always being waited on hand and foot. Your brain gets first dibs on glucose, right? It prefers glucose, all right? So if there's a glucose shortage in your body, it's really low, it's always going to go to your brain first, and the other organs have to make do with what they can, okay? So your glucose, all right, levels and concentrations of your body must always carefully be maintained. Always, always, always. Okay, because the brain needs to have what the brain wants, and it wants glucose. Okay? So what do we do, all right, when we have too much glucose? What do we do when we have too much fat? Triglycerides. What do you do when you have too many triglycerides? What do we do with the leftovers? Store them. That's right. That's right. Store it. Right on. Thank you. Thank you at home. And so in our bodies, when we have too much glucose, same thing. Yep, that's right. It's glycogen. So the glycogen here is the stored form of glucose. Okay? So when it gets stored, you need to know this. You'll see this on a test. It gets stored in these 2 tissues. Okay? Or organs, I should say. It gets stored in the liver, and it gets stored in the skeletal muscle. Okay? So when we store that stuff, we have glucose floating around in your blood, all right, and all the cells have gotten their taste, and now we have leftover, all right. Well, we're not going to pee it out because we don't want to waste it. So we're going to start to stick it into our liver and our skeletal muscle, right? And so that process that we put it into the liver and the skeletal muscle, all right, to make the stored form, which is glycogen, is called, check it out, here's that word genesis again, to make. What is it making? Glycogen. Okay? So glycogenesis is the creation or the making of glycogen. What is glycogen? Stored glucose. Okay? All right, so now it's 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and you're not going to get up and wake up to go and get something to eat, but your body still needs glucose for all of its metabolic functions, okay? The brain still needs glucose, and it's run out in the blood. So guess what? It goes and calls on the liver, and it says, liver, all right, you've got to give me some of that stored glucose, that glycogen. Start to break that glycogen down and get it back out into the blood so the brain can have its glucose. So when we break down or hydrolyze that glycogen back into glucose, we refer to that process. There's this term here, lysis. What does lysis mean? Break down. That's right. What are we going to break down? Glycogen. So glycogenolysis is when we start to break down that stored glucose, that glycogen, back into glucose. So now we dump it back into the blood and it can get up to the brain or to whatever tissue needs glucose. Okay? So that's what happens to you when you're sleeping. All right, usually around 3, 4, depends on when you go to bed actually. All right, when you had your last meal. Okay, but you'll start to deplete your glycogen levels in the middle of the night. All right, not so much from your skeletal muscle, because we want to save that glycogen, right? When you're actually doing something, when you're running or walking or working out, okay? So we're not going to mess around with the skeletal muscle glycogen. We're going to mess around with the liver's glycogen, okay? So now comes a situation in which maybe you're one of those people, is on what is it, the Atkins diet. I don't eat sugar. I don't eat carbohydrates. Well, dang, how am I going to get my glucose? No problem. Your body's come up with this process here. All right. Again, here's that term, genesis, to make. All right. Here's gluco and then neo. Neo means new. Okay. So now your body is going to get creative and make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. All right. So it's going to make new glucose from fat, from proteins. All right. So in this situation, and God bless the liver, because the liver does a lot of stuff. I won't eat liver, but I definitely appreciate liver. All right. But it is going to perform gluconeogenesis. So because you're on that Atkins diet or that no carb diet, so your liver is going to take some fats and some proteins, and it's going to make glucose from those sources. Okay? Questions? Questions at home? You guys are doing great at home. Don't think that I forgot about you. I'll never forget about you. All right. Here's a picture. All right. Of glucogenesis, glycogenesis, and then glycogenolysis. All right, so here's that monomer. Here's our glucose molecule, 6 carbon. Okay, so it's time to store it. So we're going to just basically, and that's what these represent. Each one of these little green hexagons is a glucose molecule. So all we're doing is we're going to just start sticking glucose molecules onto one another through this process of glycogenesis. Okay, so this is going on in the liver, all right, and in skeletal muscle. Oops. All right. Now, when your blood sugar gets low and we need to dump some glucose back into your blood, all right, because the brain needs it while you're sleeping, then we're going to just start cleaving these monomers. That's what these individual structures are. Those are monomers. We're going to start cleaving those off one by one through this process of glycogenolysis. You guys cool with that? You'll revisit this again next semester, or 211, okay?
For the gluconeogenesis, does that take more energy to create glucogen that way? Is that the idea behind it?
Yeah, I mean, it does cost some energy to make it, but you'll still get the same amount of energy after that from whatever glucose it made. But it's still, it's a good method, but again, it's not as good to be as good if you started off with glucose. So yeah, you will lose a little bit when it all balances out. You'll lose a little bit. When I say you lose a little bit, you won't get as much overall in the big scheme of things. All right. A couple more things when we're talking about our carbohydrates. All right. So we already talked about the glucose isomers here. Okay. We talked about that earlier on in this chapter, the galactose and the fructose. All right. We're also going to have, and we'll see these a little bit later on, the 5 carbon monosaccharides, what we call the pentose sugars. All right. Ribose and deoxyribose. We'll see those in DNA, RNA. Okay. And then we have our disaccharides. Okay, that's when we just take 2 monosaccharides and stick them together, like table sugar, milk, all right, lactose. All right, that's what we're seeing. Okay, so sucrose, lactose, maltose, we don't really talk about that one too much. All right, and then obviously we talked about what polysaccharides are, because that's glycogen. All right, you see it in animals. In plants, we refer to it as starch and cellulose. Okay. And it's great because when we're talking about cellulose, that's that fiber that we're talking about. And that's that part of the sugar that we can't digest. And that's from, does anyone happen to know what part of the plant cell that is specifically responsible for the fiber? Remember, did anyone here take plant, or this is going back to high school, trust me. I'm going back to college, but that was a very long time ago. That's the plant wall, okay? Remember, animal cells and plant cells. Plant cells have a cell wall, all right, which helps to give it that kind of structural support, kind of. And we don't have that, So that makes up that fiber, which is that undigestible portion. So here's just some pictures here. All right, I'm not going to be too concerned about that. Don't worry about that. Repeating monomer of glycogen is just glucose. And you need to know this. If you didn't write this down, make sure you have it written down. We store our glycogen in liver and in our skeletal muscles. Okay? Liver and skeletal muscles. All right. So I'm going to stop here. That's a lot. I dumped a lot on you guys, and we're not even done. I mean, we're almost done with this chapter. All right. But if you see here, talking about proteins, these are a lot of functions for protein. I'm going to tell you something right now. If anything, and we'll go over this. You'll know all these. All right. You'll know most of these when you're done with this class. All right. But you need to see all of these different functions of proteins in play. This is to show you how important proteins are in our bodies. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording here, though.